far right, we have Tracey Deutsch. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Minnesota. She teaches and researches the history of capitalism, women's history, consumer culture, and food studies. She's the author of a terrific book called Building a Housewife's Paradise, Gender Politics and American Grocery Stores in the 20th Century. And that was the winner of the 2011 ASFS Book Award. And she's also author of an article in the Radical History Review called Memories of Mothers in the Kitchen, Local Foods, History, and Women's Work. She's a recipient of a Schlesinger, and it's hard to say that word, library research grant. She's currently researching the Julia Child Project, which she'll tell us more about. Megan, sitting next to her, Megan Elias, is director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. She's the author of also a great book called Stir It Up, Home Economics and American Culture, and also another book called Food in the USA, 1890 to 1945, and Lunch, History of a Meal. So prolific author, especially 19th century women's cookbook. She knows her stuff. Erin Branch is assistant teaching professor at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and she teaches courses on writing and rhetoric. Her research interests include feminist rhetorical historiography, food studies, and autobiography and life writing studies. She's recently published on the rhetoric of Julia Child's cookbooks and MFK Fisher's essays, and her book, Transforming Tastes, is under advance contract with the University of Nebraska Press. So I'm sure that is also terrific, and we'll look forward to that. And finally, Sara Franklin is a doctoral candidate in food studies at NYU. She's a freelance oral historian, food systems educator, and writer. She's done some terrific projects outside of academia. She was a consultant at the National Museum of American History Global Food Kitchens Project. She'll tell you about her oral histories project with Judith Jones. She uses Judith Jones, the longtime Knopf editor, and her narrative, together with existing archival sources, to examine her impact on culinary publishing in the US, which is a really fascinating kind of underdeveloped topic in history, food studies, autobiography, biography.
So right now I am working on a project that grew out of an oral history of Judith Jones that I was hired to do, and trained in history, and before that trained in public health, and has raised a lot of questions for me about where are the stories that we're looking for and what gets counted as history, what sort of gets validated in the world of academia. But in terms of having been really interested in cookbooks and also in autobiographical writing, how do we nuance those as texts? Where do we go to color those stories a little bit? And so that's how I come at this topic. I've also recently begun looking at Edna Lewis, who is a cookbook author that Judith Jones edited, who's become sort of an interesting icon of the American South recently and has become emblematic of Blackness and Southernness in a way that I think is very interesting in terms of probing at questions of why we tell the stories we do and how and what's left out of those stories. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Hi, I'm Erin. I just finished up a book project that looks at the rhetoric of four very well-known figures in American food letters. It's Clementine Paddleford, MFK Fisher, Julia Child, and Alice Waters. So as a rhetoric scholar, I'm also interested in what stories tend to get left out, but rather than what counts as history, I look at sort of what counts as rhetoric. And there have been really vigorous debates in my field about whether things like personal writing, whether things like cookbooks can actually count. For a long time, rhetoric was mostly the history of speeches by dead white men. That's happily been changing quite a bit in the last 20 or 30 years. So I've been looking at how women, in my case pretty prominent women, but other women as well, make arguments that try to shape and influence American attitudes and behaviors around food and cooking.
I'm Megan Elias. I just finished, finally, writing a history of American cookbooks that covers from the end of the 18th century to like yesterday, basically, which is much too much time, obviously. So it caught me up in waves of rhetoric, and I could see ways of talking about food changing, and that was sort of what I was after. It focuses on American food, so how do American cookbooks define American food? And oh my goodness, it's really unwieldy. But it came from this recognition that cookbooks don't tell us what people eat, they tell us what people think, and the sort of the poses that they take towards food. So it's been really fun in many ways following these trends and also finding the material evidence. So this has been very much a material culture project for the material culture person in the room, really locating the voices in a lot of this stuff is stuff that was not collected. It's classically known as ephemera, including cans on labels on soup cans. So I'm really excited to talk about the archives for this evening.
As Amy said, I'm working on a book about Julia Child, and I call it the Julia Child Project because I am trying to conceptualize Julia Child's life as itself a project, one that was rooted in Cold War politics, the emerging entertainment industry, and a widespread negotiation of domesticity and gender norms and reproductive labor in the mid-20th century. And because I'm working to contextualize Julia Child in that way, my hope is that I'll be able to sort of flip things and use her life to tell us about those other forces and those other systems in American life and the ways that they were under renegotiation. I hope we have a lot of time to talk, but I'll just say that I came to that project because I am increasingly interested in this question of why and how a certain kind of food and cooking came to be so important to such a range of actors on the American political and social landscape. So I think that all of these figures can tell us something about that.
Okay, so there's tons of stuff to talk about. I'll throw out a few questions that they will address, but very soon I want to open it to questions and have you ask your questions as well and continue the dialogue. But the first one that seems obvious to address is the gender issue. So that's kind of why we're here. That's the one of the unifying forces of the panel, along with food. So I'd like you all to just think about the gender element in your project. Was it deliberate? Were you thinking about something else and gender was this category that popped up? How central is it, or is it not central? How is gender is framing your project, and how are you addressing gender? So I'm just, whoever wants to start, and the next one can pick up.
I really fought it, I should say. I really did not want to write about gender because women and cooking are always tied together, and I thought, there's something else going on here. I just want to look at the words about food for their own sake and not what they have to tell us about women's lives and women's roles. But, you can't avoid it. And what I found was, what I actually grabbed me most was when I found a discourse in the 1920s, beginning of the 1920s, about masculinity and food. And that really caught my attention, that there was a new kind of consumerism directed at men around food, and that in the process of defining men as good cooks, women had to be defined as bad cooks. So there came this split. And I have things to say about Julia Child's masculinity, which you're probably already onto. So that's just sort of what happened to me.
I would echo that. I fought it really hard and have never taken a gender studies class in my life, which is perhaps problematic, but it was interesting. I began, when I was asked to do this project around Judith Jones, that I realized I revered her as a professional and as an editor, and I thought that her gender had nothing to do with that for me, that I was sort of so so totally caught up in her success, which is, there's a long list of people that are very impressive that she's worked with, culinary and non.
Name some of those people, so in case people aren't aware of Judith Jones.
So on the culinary front, Anna Lewis, Madhur Jaffrey, Claudia Roden, she found and certainly first published Julia Child. Her culinary list goes on and on. MFK Fisher, James Beard, but she also had a long and very also prestigious career as a literary editor, and was Ann Tyler's lifelong editor and John Updike's lifelong editor. And so certainly those two were constantly influencing one another. And what I found was, even in her own autobiography, she didn't give much attention to her gender. She worked very hard, in fact, to cover it up. But that when I went to interview her, those events, the events that sort of marked her career, were completely interwoven with personal events, many of which had to do with being a woman. And the one that has stood out to me is the experience of becoming a mother, and how she was working in a man's industry, publishing. There were very few women in publishing, certainly very few women editors, and sort of trying to make a space for herself there. And I've sort of come around to paying attention to it very, very reluctantly, but it's, as you said, it's not something that I can avoid in trying to tell her life.
Well, I'll be the outlier. I did not fight it at all. I've been interested in women's writing since many years ago when I was a freshman in college and was mostly focused on literature. So my training, I think, is different from other people's. I came up in an English department, both in undergrad and graduate school. And I was always interested in women's writing, and especially women's descriptions of either their descriptions or their literary creations, descriptions of domestic spaces and women's roles in domestic spaces. And when I got to graduate school and switched my focus from literature to rhetoric, it became sort of a new problem because what counts as women's rhetoric has been such a difficult and fraught thing for rhetoric scholars to sort of get around and figure out, how do we do that? How do we study women's rhetoric? Can these women who've been largely excluded from public speaking for centuries, can what they say in private spaces or in private uncirculated documents, can that still count as rhetoric? And do our tools for rhetorical analysis work in that case? And then when I got interested in food and cooking, that was sort of a doubly marginalized discourse, because as hard as women rhetoric scholars have fought to include women's writing in the rhetorical tradition, as they call it, stuff about or writing about domestic spaces, cooking, child rearing, all of that stuff has been somewhat, I would say, systematically excluded because they don't want to privilege that sort of writing or suggest that the women who are doing it are not somehow still influenced by forces that are trying to oppress them. And I wanted to try to pull something out of that and say, no, one can be sort of intentional and purposeful even when writing about these spaces that have been historically considered sites for keeping women down or something like that. So I didn't fight it. It's actually, I think we were talking about this when we were planning for this this evening. I think it's so central to my thinking and my approach to scholarship that I don't actually even see it anymore. It wasn't really a question for me whether I would focus on women or not.
Well, Tracey? Erin is not the outlier, because I was a gender scholar long before I thought of myself as a food historian. And this is another conversation, but it was a longer journey for me to think of myself as someone who studied food as an object than someone who studied gender. And I am still a gender historian, so some of what I write is just about women's history. But I think as a gender, so I knew that I would write, that my work would be about gender and food, and I would look for projects that let me explore those categories. But what I have found is that as a gender historian, particularly working on someone like Julia Child, who is both so slippery in terms of gender and such a rich site to think about gender norms and gender performance, that being a gender historian makes me extremely sensitive to moments when gender is not there or when it's different than I expect it to be. So for instance, one thing that I'm interested in are the ways that class is part of the story of Julia Child and her social circle, and yet that doesn't get talked about in a lot of ways. People often talk about her gender as a problem, but not her class, but actually she's really interesting in that way. And also I would say the other thing that as a gender scholar is that I'm really interested, one thing I'm very sensitive to is changes over time. So Julia Child, was educated in this moment when there was a very predominant discourse about gender sameness, that men and women could be fundamentally the same. And I think and then she emerged in a moment where that was basically gone from popular discourse. So she's sort of a nice window onto changes from moments when gender was seen as a real point of difference to moments when it was seen as something you didn't talk about in polite company.
So Tracey and Erin were drawn to gender or deliberately sought out gender as a category of analysis, and Megan and Sara fought it. I'm quoting from them, reluctantly used it as a term of analysis. I'm just gonna psychological for a little tiny bit. Why did you fight it? Why were you so reluctant? What does that say about you?
I mean, I'll say in terms of choices about what to study, I felt already as a woman coming into a food studies program with a very food-centric way of thinking anyway. I mean, all the professional work I've ever done has related to food, that I was carrying around some heavy baggage for myself, and so really did not want to then go and study women in food, that felt like something that was going to pigeonhole me. Or that somehow I was going to only come up against women that looked and felt like me, which of course has not been, as you delve into a topic, and that is not the case at all. But I felt hyper aware of sort of the interdisciplinarity that I was entering, and that it was already a gendered grouping and a gendered set of topics. And I didn't want to doubly, you talk about double marginalization. I didn't want to sort of double amplify everything I did with this, sort of trying to pull things out of the shadows. It just wasn't a project I thought I was embarking on.
For me, it was a lot more strategic that there was a book. There's Jessamine Newhouse on manly meals and mom's home cooking. So there was a book already about cookbooks and gender. And I also felt like people thought that they knew that story already, right? Cookbooks teach women to just be women in the kitchen, and they're sort of oppressive and all of this stuff. And so I knew I wasn't telling that story because it wasn't the story I was finding. And so I deliberately pitched this project as not a gender history, but more a rhetorical project. But of course I have no background in rhetorical studies, so nobody bought that for long. Sometimes people will humor me and say it's a discourse analysis, which makes me feel pretty smart. So we can call it that. But it wasn't so much, self-loathing as just, and no disrespect to gender historians, which I also sort of consider myself, but strategic.
Yeah. Well, I like the different responses to thinking about gender and food together, because we all know that gender and food is so intertwined. In fact, for the women's movement of the 1970s, it was something to rebel against because there was such a strong intersection between women and food in the domestic sphere. And for those of you who've worked at the Schlesinger Library, talking to those librarians and archivists, for a long time that collection was fraught because so many people wanted to come and look at the cookbook collection, and the original board of trustees and founders were like, well, wait a minute, why is everyone looking at the cookbooks? That shouldn't be the most important part. There's other parts that are more important. And so I think the Schlesinger Library kind of fought the intersection for a long time. And I think kind of, as interest in food and food studies grew, it was just natural to see gender as this really powerful category of analysis. And just to get autobiographical for a minute, that, I started out in grad school wanting to write about women in World War II, kind of the most masculine maybe topic. Well, it turned to be women and food in World War II, and you want to get really Freudian, it was a book about my mother, and so gender, just like I couldn't leave gender if I was going to talk about food. And then my latest book, which is about baby food, I really wanted to focus on baby food as an object of material culture, and the food part. But it is so much about women. It's just funny to go back and look. I almost can't believe. But every document, every report, every advertising campaign was so gendered. There was no message other than baby food, babies, women. And so it was really it was such a natural, important category of analysis. So it's fraught. There's a tension, but it's important to tease out those tensions, but then also look at them and examine them. Anything else about gender that comes to your mind at this moment? Good. Well, we can come back to gender, and some of you may have questions about gender. But I'm going to switch and talk about the category of biography for a minute. And this was something we talked about prior to the discussion that we were all interested in. So, in the mid-20th century, you had this category of biography with a capital B, or earlier even. And those were the stories of the great men that were driving history, who would make these decisions in the political or economic sphere that would then change the course of history. And that's kind of the stories that we're told, this great man approach to history. But that drops off with the rise of social history, with cultural studies, and we understand humans' ability or inability to create events and shape events in a very different way. And in fact, maybe you could argue that the pendulum swung way in the other direction of, humans don't really even have agency and are being driven by these larger cultural and social forces. So, but you are all, in one way or the other, dealing with biography in a particular way. Maybe not Megan, but how do you resolve those tensions between the two? Writing about women who are making choices and are shaping fields and are publishing, but yet the story is much larger than that, we know. So I don't know who wants to start. Erin, do you want to start there?
Sure. I mean, some aspect of my project is trying to trouble that idea a little bit. The four women that I study, especially Julia Child, Tracey can speak more to this than I can, but there's kind of this heroine narrative, I guess, that sort of sprung up around them, that they have kind of single-handedly shaped or changed American food culture. And obviously, many people smarter and more accomplished than me have already proven that wrong, essentially. But in my project, I tried really hard to separate the sort of narrative of their life, not separate, but try to, actually, I think the word I want is connect the narrative of their life to what's going on around them. So, like in the chapter on Julia Child and the chapter on Clementine Paddleford, I'm looking at them not so much as just this sort of conduit through which this magical, influential rhetoric, came, but rather as them also responding to currents that were around them, the people that they were meeting, etc. So I didn't think of the project as biographical really at all. But I do use some biography theory for thinking about strategies that these women use to tell their stories and to make arguments, especially someone like MFK Fisher, who relies so intensely on her personal experience to make arguments.
Tracey?
Yeah, so I really struggle with this question, so I don't want to talk because I want to hear what people say. I guess the first thing I want to say is that I don't think this is a problem particular to women in culinary history. This is a moment where there's enormous interest in biographies, both within the academy, I think, and also outside of it. And so, we are also formed by our historical context, and that includes this growing interest in biography. But I agree with Erin that there's real interest, for good reason, in these women as important figures. And their archives are in some ways very seductive in that way. And I see conversations that are starting to sort of put these women into conversation with each other and move us into a world where we think about context and forces.
I think about this question a lot, and again, to use your phrase of double marginalization, I'm working on a woman who I think of as triply marginalized, because in addition to working on food and being a woman, she was an editor, which is an invisible person in the world of publishing to all but those in the industry who are actually working with her. You don't often hear editors credited, you hear the authors earning accolades. And so trying to think about where the story of Judith Jones' life lies sort of demands peeling back these various layers, and there is no coherent narrative there. There are sort of spotlights shown on different moments or on different stories or on different authors. Her authors are an important way of getting into that. But I've found it very helpful to stop thinking about biography as something that looks linear, that looks like anything that runs from birth to death, and rather to look at it as either a series of portraits or snapshots or to get theoretical, maybe even the sort of Deleuzian rhizome approach a little bit, that things pop up in places that are all connected and certainly affect one another, but they don't go up and down or straight across. I agree with you, Tracey, that I think there's a lot of interest in biography right now, and one of the things that I find is encouraging is it's across disciplines, and I think that's really enriching the conversation about how we do biography, because there's something to be taken from everyone's methodology and when it comes to looking at lives. And so I feel very lucky to be sort of doing biography in a moment where that's happening, where it's not just a historian's piece of work, or it doesn't just belong to literary scholars. I think there's all those silos are there are holes being poked everywhere, very fruitfully. Yeah.
I sort of deal with biography in the later phase of this book, where I start to talk about celebrity chefs, and so where the cookbook becomes an expression of a particular famous person, so it's almost an autobiography establishing the person, their career, their art, their self-importance too. And the great example of this is Jeremiah Tower's first cookbook, where you open it up and it has his name gigantically scrawled across the page. And he'd earlier, in fact the same year, had been compared to John Hancock, that he was writing his signature across American cuisine. So though it comes in looking at the celebrity cookbooks and their rise, but also in the dawn of the food memoir. So looking at Nora Ephron and Laurie Colwin, the telling your own story through your food. And those two authors are really especially interesting because they're not showing off really. Their cooking is very how do you say, it's kind of unappealing, and they know it. And so they're explaining themselves through this food that isn't expert. And it's certainly a different approach than the celebrity chefs who are creating themselves through this very, unreplicatable cuisine. Even though they're writing it in a cookbook, it can't be remade. So it poked in ways that really surprised me. I had no intention of, dealing with the concept of biography at all.
Why do those food memoirs kind of bother me? I guess that's autobiography, and it's self formed and shaped.
Right.
And,
Do you hate autobiography? I love autobiography. I hate biography.
I like biography better than autobiography.
I think it's two kinds.
Yeah, right. It's right. But actually, maybe some of you can talk about that, the difference between autobiography and biography. And also, as you were talking, I was reminded of kind of these waves of women's history. So just as we have like great men in history, the first wave of women's history was kind of a recovering of these great women in history, which is not an unimportant exercise, right? So kind of reclaiming the territory of the movers and the shakers who had previously been unexamined and kept out of the spotlight. So to what extent, I guess, Sara, are you, and in some ways you're doing that, you're kind of exposing a great woman in food history, and maybe some of you you're highlighting or illuminating these other prominent women in ways maybe that haven't been done before. And how much of that informs your project or not? And how do you use many of these wrote in a very autobiographical or memoirist fashion. How do you use those in your assessments and your work?
I've begun to think of them as sort of great women as a community. I mean, I think it's been really interesting in the archives, just to sort of point in that direction, to look at the correspondence between Judith Jones and her authors and see where womanhood sort of led to something, where femininity led to something fruitful that ended up in a book or that ended up earning accolades, and where it disappears altogether. In terms of using autobiography, I mean, for me, it's a very important source, and it's a source against which I compare the oral history that I've done. And to me, the most fascinating thing that comes through there is which stories almost become mythology for her, for any individual themselves, that they've repeated them so many times, they become fixed in memory. They almost get told in the same words every single time, which is sort of a fascinating phenomenon to think about, sort of the psychology of memory. And then which stories, if you probe just a little bit or ask them just a little bit differently, does that open a flood towards a completely different telling of a personal history? And so I think of autobiography as a way in, maybe more than anything. It sort of helps you know where there are hot spots that need to be probed, and that certainly helps direct you in the archives, because they can be so overwhelming to go in and sort of begin to know where to look. But I don't think of them as particularly reliable as historical sources.
Anyone else?
Well, I wish that we could all sort of travel back in time and have the first women's biographers write like you, so that you're using the biography to tell another story, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I if everyone wrote like whatever, like, I don't write like that yet, but I do think that it's a real challenge I mean, I find as I get into the writing of this that it's fine to go in with lofty ambitions about contextualizing your source, but the truth is we are linear people, and resisting a linear narrative in a biography especially is, I find, tricky. and also productive. And I actually think Sara makes a really excellent point that when you, the advantage of having lots of biographies and even autobiographies is you start to see overlap between people that allow you to sort of reframe how they've told their lives. So Judith Jones is absolutely crucial to a lot of the major food writers. And that makes you think, that sort of redirects, I think, scholars' attention to publishing and to a whole range of actors who we wouldn't otherwise see.
I mean, I think we've talked about this moment in Judith Jones's autobiography when she tells how she told Edna Lewis to write like Edna Lewis. And Edna Lewis had been writing the way that Edna Lewis thought she was. She'd been writing her story in her cookbook, but Judith Jones said, that's not what I hear, and redirected her. So Judith Jones kind of takes credit for creating Edna Lewis, right, who then becomes the voice of Southern cooking.
Right, but also elucidates how heavily edited all of this is. I mean, that no one is speaking in a natural voice. By the time something gets to print, it's just, especially if it goes through publication, reading correspondence is one thing and you might sort of think through it, but by the time a book gets published, it has been looked over so many times by so many people, and there's been so much back and forth that who is an author and who is an editor and how an audience is played, and it's so jumbled by that point that even the idea of primary source almost becomes problematic in looking at biography and life story.
And that's, I think, what I find most interesting, especially for somebody like Fisher, so many of whose essays are purportedly, anyway, autobiographical, although her sister and friends would tell you that she invented so much stuff and reframed her life so much that it's basically unrecognizable from fact, according to her sister anyway. But for me as a rhetorician, that's just as interesting because she's still deploying the personal. She's still using I. She's still claiming this as experience that we could all take as models, even if it has been heavily edited and whatever. So as a rhetorician, I'm interested in that as a strategy. But I agree with you that I wouldn't take most autobiographies or life writing as a historical source in quite the same way.
Right, and that brings up the whole interesting field of book history and book technology and production, kind of what it takes to get a voice from its raw form to that lovely, polished, beautiful end point, which is very different. Let me ask a question about archives, and then I want to hear your questions as well. So you're all academics working in the archives, using a multiplicity of sources. Archives are really important. How did you go into the archives? How did you choose a set of archives? What did you find? What did you go in expecting to find? Where is the gender in the archives? Was it hard to find? Was it there in front of your face? Kind of talk to us about that.
Well, I have a funny story about this, so I'll start. My first project had no archive. It was on grocery store retailing, and the archives that existed were kept in corporations that corporations wouldn't let me into, basically. So it was a widely scattered archive, and it was really, that turned out to be a very fruitful process that helped me to sort of reframe grocery stores in ways I wouldn't have if I'd only had a corporate archive to work with. But for the second project, I was like, I am never doing that again. And I was excited at the idea of a project where the archive was extensive and more or less contained, at least my original research was. And it is Julia Child kept everything. She has extensive archives, both at NYU and at the Schlesinger. And it's been a really wonderful experience, but it's hard to find a consistent message about gender in her archive because they're so extensive. So and this gets back to what we were saying about autobiography, she presents herself in different ways at different moments to different people all the time. So having this extensive archive is, I think, has become for me a way to help complicate gender in the work and in general.
Well, archives have been very difficult for me because I've been trying to figure out what people are saying about American food and American cookbooks, and so sort of the books that I really want are the books that are on people's kitchen shelves where I can't see them, So I had to develop a strategy, right, for finding what I wanted, and I had to make sure that it was clear what I was doing, because the time frame that I'm covering is so wide. So I really have to sell my methodology in a way that I haven't in the past. So I chose the Library of Congress. You know, their catalog it's a little weird, but it's recognized. You know, people would say, oh, the Library of Congress, right? That's the catalog for you. And I sort of argue that it isn't, because it has some glitches, but I just spent hours and hours and hours going through American, cookery, or cookery, American, sometimes one way, sometimes the other way, just to catch everything decade by decade, to catch trends. And then when I thought I was catching a trend, I would go follow it for a while and see if it was really a trend. And so my archival experience was often a computer face experience. And then when I started looking at the corporate cookbooks, which was probably my favorite part of this whole project, those are just not mostly in libraries. And if they're in libraries, they're in a little package that says ephemera 1920s, and it's a grab bag. So a lot of that I just bought for myself on eBay. And I have wonderful little tiny little things. I just got a great one about mayonnaise and salads yesterday, which I should have brought with me, but it's too precious to share. And so a lot of this is making my own archive, is the things that I want. If they're out there, I have to get them for myself, because I can't find them in the Library of Congress, even in the catalog, because they're advertising stuff.
I think I went to the archives, at least for Julia Child and MFK Fisher, with a really specific goal, so that made it easy. I was looking for a couple things. I was looking for correspondence between them and between a few other people, including Judith Jones. And I was also looking for contemporary reviews of their books and fan letters, which I found lots of for Julia Child. But when I went to the Paddleford archives in the Little Apple, Manhattan, Kansas, that was a whole different ballgame, because I didn't really know what I was looking for, and her papers include 363 boxes of stuff. She was the ultimate pack rat. And I really don't have a great method for approaching that. I just kind of picked the things that looked interesting, and my argument for her kind of emerged from that. So I can't say that in that case gender was especially salient. It probably emerged a little bit when I was at the Schlesinger Library, just because both women and men wrote to Julia Child in particular in kind of equally adulatory terms. But with Paddleford, it was less of a thing, probably because she had such a different kind of career than the others.
I guess I'm a little different in this case, because my archive is also a living one, and I'm alone in that. And that makes it really slippery, because we did our interviews a year and a half ago, and if I went back to her today and tried to probe at some of those questions, or even ask some of the same questions, we would have a different kind of a conversation. I'm a little different than I was, and she's a little different than she was. And so, I've been thinking about archives as living things too, and how in doing recent history in particular, how do we integrate living sources into doing history? I mean, someone who's had a life as long as Judith Jones, who just turned 90, has an enormous knowledge of the 20th century in particular. And how can we use that to contextualize her story, and vice versa? How can we use sort of social history to contextualize her? But I think, having talked about a little how the autobiography and the interview made clear for me that certain stories were very fixed, I went to the archives at the Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, looking for other stories that she wasn't telling me. I sort of started playing sleuth at that point. So knowing that this is a woman who has sort of cultivated a public image, and that I might find something in her correspondence that wasn't part of her public record. So I went in sort of looking around the corners, I would say.
And at UT, those were the Knopf archives?
Those are the Knopf, yeah, all of the Knopf papers until they were bought in 2002, I want to say, are there, and then the later papers are at the New York Public Library.
Okay. And so since she was an editor at Knopf,
all her
you were
professional
just looking
correspondence
for-
from the time she started in 57 until the time they were bought was there. Also many, many, many boxes. I mean, days, weeks, months worth of notes, scribbled notes and interoffice memos and the like. So.
Questions? Does anybody have a question they would like to ask?
Yeah, I felt the importance of sort of rehabilitating the creators of ephemera as authors, which is hard because they often don't have names. so it's awkward to say the author of the How to Create the Correct Salad says this, or, so the person doesn't have a name. But the idea that I'm trying to fight the idea that they're not credible because they're writing for money. In a sense, everybody's writing for money, right? I mean, and MFK Fisher is writing for her own less than perfect, ethical reasons, whatever. But so to sort of bring that in the foreground and to say these are expressions of a time, and they have a purpose, but they're also part of a culture. So you wouldn't write a book about the correct salads in another culture and another time. So they're expressing a moment. And the fact that we don't know their names and we just know that they were writing as business people, there's this sort of bias towards the artist, right? Where MFK Fisher is an artist, but the nameless correct salad author is not. And I'm really working to try to undo that bias. So it's something that I'm struggling with and hoping to be successful in. And I think Carolyn de la Pena is a good model here. Do you know her work? She writes about, she has this great thing about the tomato men, who were these scientists who invented, not quite the square tomato, but the tomato that can be sent all over the world and isn't very tasty. And people have just sort of derided them for a long time because their motives weren't the kinds of motives that people who like food like. And she really looks at them from their own time and their own motivation and takes them seriously what they're doing, which for me was very liberating that you could do that. And I'm trying to do that with these ephemeral authors too. Because the stuff was everywhere too, right? More correct salad brochures than MFK Fisher, beautiful essays, right? But it's a struggle.
Related to that question, did any of you, Megan, or any of you find, the documents tell us a lot of things, right? So there's the content, there are the words on the page or the pamphlet or the cookbook, but then there's other clues that give us information. There's food stains on the cookbooks or fingerprints or especially worn pages. I mean, did those other kinds of information come up to you in your search of the materials?
I think it was something I noticed in the process of doing these interviews, was just looking around Judith Jones's home and noticing that she used the books of the author she had edited exhaustively. I mean, they were worn and stained, and she kept them by her stove. And that began me thinking about the relationships between these women, and also the relationship that she had with these things as material objects in her home, and trying to find some way to attend to that. And I don't quite know how I'm going to do that yet, or if it's possible even, but that we're all dealing with textual stuff, and that's both materiality and narrative, which is not really material stuff. And there is a relationship between those things, and it's really hard to capture.
Anybody else?
Well, this is actually how I start my book, by talking about a cookbook that I have that has an annotation in it. Because I bought the book used, the annotation isn't mine, and I've then added my own expression, but not through, I haven't written in it, but I've just messed it up by using it, so that there are these two layers of kind of a writing in this particular book. But then what I argue is that those marks are actually mostly inaccessible to us as scholars. But sort of to encourage anyone who wants to make that kind of journey into cookbooks to search out those markings, right, and to figure out what kind of language they are. But I'm sort of trying to make the point that it's not something you can read systematically, I think. But it's funny that you would ask that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of ephemera is really interesting in terms of the archive, because ephemera are the things that we find that in some ways are hard to know what to do with, given most of our training. And I have found ephemera not so much in her papers, which are really nicely processed, but in people who have things about her that they share with me. or that I come across. So a lot of fans wrote in and they sent ephemera with their letters. In the early days, people would show up at the studio with things they had made or apples that they had picked that they thought she would like. And I think those really speak to the incredible importance of objects, and especially around food.
And I personally didn't do much work with ephemera, but there's a scholar in my field named Nan Johnson who did a history of sort of elocution guides and other things for women around the turn of the 19th century, and all she did was look at ephemera because most of this stuff is not archived. She finds it in rummage sales and flea markets and occasionally eBay. And she has a piece that she wrote about her methodology for what to do with this huge pile of stuff. And it's not very scholarly, but she called it the wheel. She just literally piled stuff in loose categories around her on the floor and tried to look for patterns. And in rhetoric, you can kind of get away with that because you're looking for things like circulating discourses. So if there are a whole bunch of books about mayonnaise that were all circulating in the early 50s, I'm making up data here, I don't know this at all. What does that tell us about the place of mayonnaise in popular culture? And no, you can't say it with perfect certainty, but that's something that I think rhetoric scholars who do work on popular culture deal with a lot. Like, you have to kind of make your best guess based on sort of the prevalence or prominence of particular kinds of arguments or documents. Again, it's not something that's hasn't been central to my work yet, but I think it's something that people are working on.
Well, and we can never say it with certainty, right? Because the thing that's missing from food studies archives is the food. That's the one thing we never have. And I think it's sort of interesting that all of I mean, I am a little obsessed with storytelling, it's true, but all of what we're looking at is stories about our relationships to food. It's not the food itself, ever. And
Was
so
it
how
ever
do we...
for you with Judith Jones? I've always wondered if food ever entered your conversations. Like, did she feed you?
We did. We cooked together and she fed me. I don't think she would invite anyone into her home without offering. That's so totally ingrained in her way of, I'm trying to resist the word hostessing, but that's, I suppose, what she's doing, of being hospitable in her home, and is such a part of her life. But, I was thinking about that in the context of the archives questions, and the stuff that we're most interested in is totally absent from the archives that we're looking at. That's true. I mean, it's embodied, yes. Oh, God, that's a whole other.
Good. Another question. Yes, one and then two.
I'll take a stab.
Well, of course it matters. Next.
I can try to answer, or at least give you part of an answer, because I'd faced the same question from my committee, like, why food, and especially why women in food, to go back to where we started. The argument that I made, and I guess was satisfactory enough, was that this is something that people are dealing with every day, constantly. And whether or not people actually cooked from these cookbooks, and you can find evidence that they did, either because they're used or because other people wrote about them in other ways, they were still circulating, I keep overusing that word, but they still said something about at least what people were buying. So maybe what they aspired to cook, or what they thought was good food, or maybe it was even a sort of a class or prestige performance thing, like if you have Julia Child or whomever on your shelf, that's saying something about what people perceived as prestigious or socially valuable in some way. So that was part of my argument for why I needed to, make this intervention in rhetorical studies, is that it is so ordinary in a lot of ways. It's something that's almost invisible, since we deal with food and cooking in some way almost every day. So these documents that we can collect do tell us something, not necessarily about what people were actually cooking and eating, but certainly about what they valued in terms of cooking and eating.
From where I stand, if a group of people in publishing thought it mattered enough to take a financial gamble on it, it's worth studying. I mean, some group of people at some point said we're hoping to win on this rather than lose on this. So something was happening in a microculture there, which points towards all sorts of other cultural phenomena, hopefully. But to me, take food out of it. If you're just looking at publishing, from my standpoint, that matters. I mean, there's all sorts of economics going on there and politics going on there, and.
And for me, it's part of the bigger conversation about who belongs in America. What is food and what is not food, what is good food, what is bad food. And I think a lot of even policy decisions get made with an assumption that we know what food is for everybody, and I don't think that's true. So I think ultimately there are real decisions being made based on this long history of thinking about food, about the words about food, that they become real in food pantries. And is it meaningful? Some days I wake up and say, no, it wasn't. Yes.
So I think about this a lot, and I want to pick up on something that we've all said, which is that when you see if you only looked at books that people followed religiously, you would have a sense of the world as a very smooth running place, right? But looking at these discursive pressures on people, like the many ideas that circulated around food, and Amy can talk about this better than I can, you get a sense of how charged food is as a site, and cooking is as a site, and homes are, right?
Right.
So I actually think one has to understand what people are negotiating around food and why it always matters so much.
A lot for me, yeah. I mean, at some point I thought I should really be writing a different book about illustrations of food and then text about food. But because they're constantly talking to each other, I couldn't do that. And one of the big things that I discovered was that the slow shift towards the purely pictorial cookbook. So that now when you think of a cookbook, buying one as a present for somebody, you expect it to have really good big pictures. And I had to trace back to when that became possible. And before it became technologically possible, it wasn't done. And there were other methods used to visually entice the reader, and a lot of that came out of these ephemeral cookbooks. They were the first to use color, and they were the first to create scenarios, sort of fantastical, romantic scenarios around food. So a lot of it that pictorial came from the commercial. It's not surprising, right? But yeah, for me, the images were, almost all of the story, right, that they're telling. They're speaking just as much as the words are, and sometimes I would have to remind myself, there are words on this page too, just to get back into the actual recipe.
Anyone else?
I just found that the farther I went along in history, I mean, this is echoing what Megan just said, but the more important images came. Like when I was reading especially recent books by or about Alice Waters, there'll be these are not like normal sized books either. They're coffee table sized books with a picture of just radishes or something. And so these really ordinary, however beautiful Photoshop pictures of foods are meant to stand in for this whole ideology, in her case in particular. Whereas in earlier texts where probably this kind of photographic, duplication wasn't as possible or wasn't cheap, like the illustrations in the early editions of Mastering the Art of French Cooking are mostly drawings, mostly by Julia Child's husband. And so they're not so much, I don't think, meant to be enticements as sort of additions.
They're meaningful. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, but they're meant to supplement the instruction, I think.
No, I think they're also, they have a class message too, right? That what would you say?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think they have a class message, right? But they also have a class content. The idea behind the drawings was that finally there would be a clear diagram that would show people exactly how to debone a turkey. So it's a really different model of what an illustration does than the radishes in Alice Waters' cookbook. The idea was that you would actually be doing this cooking. And I will just say, as an aside, I think it also, like, the content of the images as well as their production values says a lot about, it's really quite instructive about the emphasis of an author or a cookbook.
Because it's artistic. Those drawings are by an artist. They're not just in a manual, And it's true of all the illustrations. There's nothing that you find that's just workman. It's all telling you something. Like if you think about the Moosewood cookbook, about that, right? Those drawings, and that was part of a whole trend in cookbooks and in publishing in general to get loose with the line and the layout and that's exactly that's the academic term for it. Yeah, but so the illustrations are never just casual. Oh, except in one case that I can think of. I won't talk about that.
Well, I want to say something, and then I really want you to talk, actually. But to me, the only ubiquity here is that we are willing to spend money on food and on objects related to food right now. I mean, I think if nothing else, the sale of cookbooks and what's happened to it recently is phenomenal. I mean, the growth is tremendous, and that makes it interesting historically. How did we get from there to here? I don't know that we can ever know about the ubiquity of what people were doing in kitchens. I don't know that we ever will have access into that information. But there's a consumerist thread here that's very important that, you're right, is totally classed. But something that I'm finding really interesting is that as the objects of cookbooks are becoming one part of a larger food media landscape, a large part of which is not for sale, which is blogs and Pinterest boards and Instagram and it circulates for free, is buying power becoming less important in the cultural conversation around food? I don't know, and my gut says no, but it's the first time that the sort of cultural capital that goes along with owning or understanding images around food is circulating without currency being exchanged.
And I think what Erin does really wonderfully is to bridge that I mean, when you're talking about rhetoric, you're talking about doing, right? So that the words are acts in a sense, not to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. But that's a question that I wrestled with a lot in my project, and it was another thing that my committee wanted me to talk more about, is that this, studying these women who mostly emerged from middle and even upper middle class families and were able to devote their lives to something that was, in a couple cases ended up being really profitable, but wasn't a guarantee of profit, is a luxury, right, of their class position. And it's a luxury of other people's class positions to be able to sit down and read a book about, delicious oysters or whatever. And actually, there's an article that I read recently about Julia Child and Martha Stewart as kind of selling the illusion of class mobility. So I think it's just something that we constantly have to pay attention to. Throughout all of my writing, I always sort of, at the end of various sections, have to point out again, or feel like I have to point out again, that this is a classed issue. To me, I think, I'm going to refer back again to my Julia Child research in particular, but certainly, and Tracey, you're going to have to fill in here if I'm missing things, but certainly in mid-century America, it was not only, the sort of middle-class luxury of preparing pick your recipe that was only available to some people, but it was also the aspiration to French culture that I think was particularly appealing. So I'm not sure where I was going with that, but I think it's still about, maybe it is the illusion of class mobility, or that by performing a certain kind of attitude or practice around food, you can at least engage in practices that wouldn't otherwise be available to you because of your class. So it's not something I have a great answer for, but it's definitely something I feel like I'm struggling with.
I think I notice a kind of, you can aspire and you can affirm. You can do both of those things with your cookbook. You can say, I know I'm middle class because I make these things, or I know I'm successful because I'm making these things. Or you can say, if I make these things, I will be that class. You can imagine it. So I think a lot about the affirmation of the books too, that they reassure people you are in the right place, you are doing the right things. And especially in 19th century cookbooks, that was so important for people to claim middle classness. And that I am not in the kitchen anymore. And so I can have other people do all these very elaborate stuff that you'd never have time to do, so it's a great, interesting question about what you're doing when you're reading too.
Yeah. I think there is so much unexplored terrain with regard to cookbooks. We don't really know how people use them, why they buy them, which go on their shelves, which go in their kitchens, which is on the coffee table. Yes, there is definitely a strong class element to it, but I think the drive to make something with your hands is so strong that I think that transcends class. But yet how that is done may be very different depending on one's socioeconomic status and circumstance. And it just feels very exciting for me, just as people go in now and look in people's fridges and want to know what's in their fridges. I want to be the fly on the wall and watch how people use cookbooks or the internet, or what is a recipe and how do people cook, and what are the texts through which people are cooking at all socioeconomic levels.
Yeah. Such an interesting question. I'm just starting, so I probably won't have a very polished answer for you, but I always found it really fascinating that her first cookbook, which was the Edna Lewis cookbook, which was largely about the Cafe Nicholson culinary experience, failed. And The Taste of Country Cooking was a huge success. And I have a sense that people were dissatisfied with the Cafe Nicholson version of someone they thought held sort of a secret to some American, a particular authenticity of the American experience, of a particular American experience that was not shining through in that book. And it's very, very different in The Taste of Country Cooking. It is a book in which she claims a very particular rural southernness. I think it's a really interesting book right now because it's all about locale, and it's about cooking from scratch, and it's about gardening, and all these things that have become so hyper important to sort of nouveau agro pure food culture. But to me, what happened between those two books is sort of where one of the hidden stories lies. And what happened in that space that helped her become authorized. I think some of it was claiming an Americanness rather than a Frenchness. Cafe Nicholson was French, but she served Southern dishes to certain people from the South who requested them or knew she served them. And so sort of shedding the foreign identity and claiming, embracing Americanness. And there weren't a lot of successful, sort of mass successful cookbooks that had done that to date. I mean, she sort of started, I think, a real change in terms of representation of regionality and of particular groups of people, and sort of honing in on understanding that American food doesn't look like one thing, but looks like lots of different kinds of things. And she was a strong voice that shone through fairly early on.
Although she does have these moments in that book that I find really interesting rhetorically, where she claims a middle-class identity. She has the dish of blancmange, and she says, it may surprise you to find blancmange in, you know, that moment. And there's something else, the asparagus, they go picking wild asparagus, they have the wild mushrooms. There's this great thing where she says, well, if you can't find wild mushrooms, you can buy them at Bloomingdale's. And it's so knowing, you know, it's so like, I'm not who you think I am, and my people aren't who you think they are either. And I in that, it's such a writing in that moment. It's like, there's the bicentennial, but there's also all of these other Black Power cookbooks that have just come on the market, and she's sort of fitting herself in there. It's one of the most interesting books, I think.
When was that published?
Rufus.
76.
Because he was a, what would you call it? Not a Pullman porter.
Right.
And so he's going between the class,
Yeah.
where he lived and where he worked.
And Tonight does the same thing. Tonight is very, there are some beautiful things in there. There's one about a little girl who makes dinner for her family, and all you middle class mothers should kind of think about this girl when you're cooking. But Tonight is so, she's so of that ebony world that she wrote for, that it's hard to categorize her with anybody else. I mean, all of these books really kind of have to stand alone, which is interesting. You know Pat Clark? I have to keep referring to Pat Clark. Pat Clark is writing a history of African American cookbooks. Any day now it'll be out and we can answer all these questions. But so she's really focusing on all of these stories together. But they just kind of don't fit in, which is what's so fascinating.
Other questions? Other question? Is there something that we've missed? Is there a question, something that we would be important to talk about, or is there something that you want to ask each other?
What did Judith Jones cook you?
Alex is here too. He has more stories than I do. I was waiting for you to sneak in. A delicious thing. I mean, but very mundane things. Very much things you would cook for yourself on a weeknight. I mean, not fancy food. I don't know if you've had that experience too, but you know, there's no pomp and circumstance in my experience of her.
I guess I'd like to ask Tracey. I'd like you to talk a little more about gender vis-a-vis Julia Child, because she's such a masculine character,
Right.
Person or persona, but yet clearly this female force. And tell us about that.
Yeah. So first, actually, I did have a thought about Krisha's question, so I'm going to say really quickly that I think that one thing that's interesting to me about cookbooks is that they define certain kinds of tasks as doing and other kinds of tasks as not doing. So one thing that's absent from cookbooks a lot of the time is how you get these ingredients, right? So consumption is not work, that's not doing, but actual cooking, that's work. And so that gets a lot of attention. So the whole category, I mean, I think this is a really interesting thing to think about, but the binary between doing and thinking is something that cookbooks make, right? They help to create that. Julia Child then messes up every gender binary I could possibly use. I just have, I don't have a definitive answer. I think, though, that she complicates the story that we often tell about gender in mid-century U.S., right? Which is that it was a very conservative time in terms of gender norms, which it clearly was. At the same time, she is not only utterly unapologetic about her masculinity and her performance and her doing this work, she is also widely and immediately beloved. Yeah. I mean, her show was, because of her performance, her cookbook was successful, but her show was like a phenomenon when I read the correspondence at WGBH. So that speaks to a much more complicated landscape than we often give that moment credit for. And I think that that's worth thinking about as we tell the story of gender and gender norms in American life.
Well, Laura Shapiro in her book, Reinventing, or something from the oven, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, because she ends that book by creating a parallel narrative between Julia Child and Betty Friedan, and saying what Betty Friedan is doing for the women's movement, she's walking out of the kitchen, yet Julia Child is telling us that we can be in the kitchen, and kind of men and women. I mean, it seems like that it was an entree for men to be competitive home cooks as well as females. So I mean, kind of that interesting contrast. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think that's right in terms. It is absolutely right that Julia Child wanted men to be in the kitchen and wanted them to be cooking. She had a very complicated relationship with women's liberation and second wave feminism. And she was not at all a fan of the idea that cooking was something to be avoided or that it was a source of oppression. She just felt like if it was a source of oppression, then you shouldn't do it. I mean, she really, or she felt bad for you, but then you just weren't part of her audience. You weren't part of her universe. So I wouldn't say that she's often hailed as a kind of feminist, and she did create career pathways for women, and she absolutely championed women chefs. But I think she makes us kind of complicate the story we tell about women's liberation and the ways that a sort of focus on cooking as a problem became increasingly hard to sustain in popular discourse, right? That fell away from a lot of the work on cooking. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but it's a problem.
Good. Well, why don't we thank our panelists? This was terrific, and thank you to the audience as well.